So, what we talk about when we don't talk about mental health. In 2022, the theme for Mental Health Awareness Week was loneliness. That year I was asked to give a talk for Experian, which I called Alone in a Crowded Room. This year the theme is community. It's not surprising that this talk has a lot of common ground with that one from 3 years ago. Because as I put it then, we feel most alone when we find ourselves among a community of which we do not feel a part. The very particular lens through which I want to look at this phenomenon is the question I've been asked more than any other in almost 2 decades of giving talks about mental health in the workplace. It's the question from every manager who wants to do the right thing but doesn't know where to start. How do I get my team to tell me when something's wrong? Or asked another, more frustrated way, why don't people tell me when something is wrong? The answer almost always is that when people are experiencing poor mental health, living through mental illness, and need support but feel unable to ask for it, whatever, or whether that's at work or among family or even friends, it's because they feel like they've been dropped into a community of which they aren't a part. And the answer to the despairing manager's first question is that people will only talk openly if they feel like they're in a community of which they really are a part. There are many layers to those answers, and the questions of community identity, belonging, openness and closeness, and of course language and its use, on which they depend, are far outside the scope of the talk for mental health awareness. That sounds really weird, like I'm now laughing when I say mental health awareness, but it's actually just a trolley outside, in all but the most superficial way. This is a simple response to that despairing cry, why don't they tell me, from someone who is frequently not told. Although writing this has all too frequently reminded me of the silences that I face as someone who manages a team, and my own complicity in creating spaces where people do not feel enough belonging to tell. This is the point in the talk where I talk a little about my own experience. Doing so answers the question, who are you to talk about this? Although I'm sure that most of the people here in person today know me and know something about my medical and trauma history already. So I'm neurodivergent in several ways, and although those aren't directly relevant to today, like many, the history of how people have reacted to me being me over many decades has played a significant part in amplifying depression and anxiety, creating trauma and contributing to a general sense that it is most definitely not okay to be yourself in a place of work, so you'd better find ways to pretend. That you can communicate the same way others do, that you don't feel physical pain from sensory overload, that task switching is just a breeze, even if trying to do it while running through some prepared script means you will need to retreat to a quiet place and cry and get no work done for the rest of the day. When it comes to mental illness, I'm bipolar. I had my first really dark and sustained episode of depression when I was 14. By then I was very used to being bullied for absolutely failing to fit in at school, but until that time my response had simply been fear. I learned that people simply weren't safe to be around, and although I was unsure why others didn't see the world as a place of terror, I was actually relatively content so long as I could stay away from people and indulge my passion for reading and writing, and role-playing games with the 2 or 3 people in my year who are at least somewhat like me. But that equilibrium tipped over into my first experience of depression when I was 14 and lasted for more than a year. During that time, I talked to no one. The one thing that occupied all my effort was managing enough nods and smiles to avoid my parents thinking I'd developed a drug problem. So this is around the time of Grange Hill's Just Say No campaign, for those who remember. And the message coming from TV was that if teenagers went suddenly quiet, then they had fallen in with the wrong crowd and they were on heroin, and you should involve people. And that was the last thing I wanted, to get people involved. My experience of depression then and since was best described as experiencing the world from within a thick glass bowl. Life was there, somewhere, but outside, elsewhere, for other people and not for me. But my thoughts were very much inside, bouncing off the walls of the bowl with me. They were then, and have remained for the episodes that followed, largely thoughts of fear. Some a generalised existential fear, not aided by growing up in the 1980s, truly believing the world was about to end, and you will no doubt have noted that Threads has reappeared in the public consciousness. So yes, this is what we were shown as 13-year-olds in our chemistry class. And certainly not aided by being an overthinker who internalised and ruminated on that thought. And most definitely not aided during my second prolonged episode when I arrived here in Oxford and was introduced to 19th century existentialism. And some as a particularised fear, also driven by overthinking and an inability to escape catastrophising loops. It's hard to describe what this feels like to someone who has no similar experience, but it's this fear that makes talking about mental illness and asking for help so difficult for so many of us. I might describe it as the fear of a delicate equilibrium unravelling, by which I mean that many of us have built lives that, while the shell of the lives we see around us, we can nonetheless just about sustain. We're walking a wire without external forces. We might just be able to walk, we believe, until it reaches its end. But the slightest breeze we know will blow us down, hurtling to the ground, and we see the shadow of that breeze in every interaction. Every email, every knock, every hello, every letter, every hint of change that might be the prelude to the tap of the wind at our shoulder. Everyone, of course, experiences life's buffeting winds, but if you walk on a sturdy tarmac surface on the ground, it's perfectly possible to set yourself against the high gales and move forward. When you live on a tiny wire high in the clouds, the only hope of safety is to flee from every possible movement of the air. Understanding a life of living with mental illness in this way makes it clear that anyone who has made it this far has done so only because, among many other things, they have developed a finely tuned skill for spotting the first signs of incoming breeze. As an aside, it might be helpful to think in these terms the next time you have a conversation about resilience. Who is it who is really the more resilient? The person living on a high wire who remains aloft when a 10-mile-an-hour breeze blows, or the person driving a car along the highway below who struggles to steer through a 30-mile-an-hour gust? Which of the two really has the most to gain from the other? The answer, of course, is that the latter would benefit a great deal from the former's insights, and the former would benefit a great deal from the latter's infrastructure. The up of bipolar is probably best kept for another day with more time. In a fittingly whirlwind tour, let me just say, believing that even 2 hours sleep a night is not only a waste but utterly unnecessary for months at a time does not end well. That frustration, anger even, that the world is so slow that people will just not keep up with you, does little to foster good relationships. And the lack of impulse control that means you convince yourself and the Blackwell's accounts department that you just have to have 23 translations of the Bible to stand any chance of passing your degree, at least it was a theology degree, that leaves lifelong scars in your finances. There's a second set of experiences that those of us who have lived with poor mental health bring with us. Those we have with the institutions we have to interact with as part of life, from employers to essential services. The first time you talk to someone outside of your immediate circle, it's a big deal. The emotional bonds and implicit connections that might be there between familial and friendship groups are not present, though this, of course, can be positive as well as negative. But there is a formality that is present. It matters existentially that the interaction goes well, because without it, our ability to function in the world at all can dry up instantaneously. The coping strategies of self-care we employ with problematic families and fair-weather friends are not available with the people who pay for our survival, or the institutions that turn that money into shelter and energy. My own first time was almost exactly 20 years ago. I was new to the university's support staff. I'd spent 10 years here as a student, right up until having a breakdown at a rather unfortunate time in my doctorate. After that, I was unable to get a job anywhere except as a warehouse hand, though that's still the actual job I've enjoyed most and probably been best at. Eventually moving like a drunken meeple in an exotic board game to become manager at a luxury flooring showroom, from where I jumped to here, looking after a building I'm still rather fond of on Pusey Lane. I was still new enough to knowing that I needed help, and to having an employer that said it was willing and able to provide it, that I thought I should tell my manager. So I did. After a week of sleepless nights and scripting, I told her I'm bipolar. I got a first nervously deflecting with a joke, reflexive response of, "You're not going to stab me, are you? Ha ha ha." Followed fairly swiftly by the more considered, "That's fine as long as you're taking medication." I still haven't quite figured out which is worse, but as a 1-2, they packed quite some heft. Zoom forward 2 decades. Last summer, my father died, and as his only traceable surviving relative, it was my job to sort out his somewhat tangled affairs, a still ongoing task. This involves a lot of interactions with a lot of organisations I haven't encountered before, and I almost certainly won't encounter again. And that means that what's possibly not the most energised and competent I've ever been, having to tell a lot of people what adjustments I need them to make, mostly around communications, specifically not using the telephone. Because, and this is something so many organisations and people don't seem to get, the fact that a situation is a bit of an emergency and deadlines are tight doesn't miraculously mean that we can do the things we can't do. Except, of course, it's even more complicated because there are some things we can do once, maybe, using every last drop of energy and leaving us unable to function at all for days after. But if we do that, people write it in a mental diary and wheel out, "But you did it then," for decades to come. One of those was my father's bank. It turns out the bereavement team is a small one and they can only communicate by phone. I pointed out the problem to the very nice person in branch, to which the response was a helpful alternative that I could sign over power of attorney for someone else to do everything on my behalf. This is an illustration of such a common occurrence. Tell someone you have what's a really simple to implement support need, and they respond by offering to remove your autonomy. I wouldn't be a lived experience expert on mental illness and debt if I had £1 for every time I've heard someone on the recruitment panel say about someone with a mental health condition, "I don't want to put them under any pressure." What I really want this stroll down memory lane to leave you with can be summed up by going back to that metaphor of mental illness as living on a high wire, and what that means for someone who wants their team to tell them when they need help. The answer isn't to tell people they really are on the ground and insist they step forward accordingly. We don't need much imagination to see how that will end. Rather, if you need us to take those steps, you must build us roads in the sky. And then you need to show that road is safe. There needs to be a map and a sign that say it's different this time, and we need to see that the terrain bears this out. So how do we do this? Let's begin with some figures. My experience of being asked how to enable people to talk about their mental health difficulties would suggest the reluctance to do so is widespread, but is it? It turns out that's a straightforward question to answer, and the answer is yes. It's true in the workplace. A Comres study for the BBC found that 49% of people would not tell their manager if they had mental health difficulties, and 65% would not tell their colleagues. And it's true elsewhere. In 2022, I co-authored a set of guide manuals for the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute, aimed at helping companies to understand why so few of their customers tell them about poor mental health, when doing so would lead to better support for them. The figures are even starker there than they are in the workplace. Money and mental health research showed that when it came to essential services providers, utilities, telecoms, financial services, the rate of disclosure amongst those living with poor mental health ranged from 11 to 15.15%. That work we did at Money and Mental Health was intended to help firms create what we called disclosure environments. That is, spaces where people feel that it's okay to talk about how mental ill health affects them, where they feel they won't be judged or treated unfairly for doing so, and where doing so will make an actual positive difference to the service they receive, with adjustments put in place to help them access and use the services we all rely on. And it turns out, unsurprisingly, that the elements of good disclosure environments for essential service providers have a lot in common with what I've been saying to managers about how to create workplaces where staff are comfortable at talking for many years. And that's because, as I hope I conveyed from my own experience, there is only one thing a successful disclosure environment or a safe workplace really needs to do, and that's to convey the simple message, it's different here. It's worth reading out the first principle we wrote in that guidance about disclosure environments, and then we'll get to unpacking why it's so hard, but how we can start. We said, by routinely sending signals to consumers that indicate both that disclosure is welcome and show how disclosed information will be used, firms will help lift barriers to disclosure. So let's start to draw these figures and anecdotes into something we can use to start to make our spaces better. And I'll begin with 4 factors that contribute to someone not feeling that they can talk about their mental health, before drawing out a general principle that lies behind them all. If you've ever hesitated before talking, I'm sure you'll recognise some of these. They're present in my experience, and they all came through in the responses of Money and Mental Health's 5,000 strong research community. First, there is a fear of the assumptions that will be made and the consequences of those assumptions. This might be a fear that telling your bank you need a communication adjustment will lead to a narrowing of credit options, to the fear that telling your manager you need time for talking therapy appointments will lead to a lack of opportunities at work. Second, in the workplace and outside, there is a fear of hostility from peers. We've seen this in the difference between the number of people who wouldn't talk to their manager and the far greater number who wouldn't talk to their colleagues. This is the same fear driven by a constant media narrative. It's also too often present in the way even well-meaning managers talk about workload, something that I know is a buzzword here in Oxford. From seemingly good practice, like thanking those who go above and beyond the call of duty, to the more malign tendency to emphasise the stress that a team is under in ways that subtly and not so subtly imply emotional, if not technical, guilt to anyone who might need adjustments or accommodations or, heaven forbid, time off. And in times of more overall pressure, the tendency for this can be even greater and is rarely considered by already overstretched managers who revert to the approach that emergency times call for the suspension of all but emergency measures. Third is a belief that nothing will change for the better if we do ask. And that's one of the most frequently cited reasons for people not telling their banks what their needs are. And often it's based on experience of systems that can't turn a request into an action, or a reliance on a pressed staff member remembering to check a customer record, or not understanding what it is they're being asked to do. I've spent a lot of time corresponding with various parts of Oxfordshire's medical network in the past 5 years, for example, and my experience is that about 20% of the time a requested adjustment will be provided, and on more than half of those occasions, only after I've had to remind people of something in theory they know and are legally required to have recorded, to remember and to implement. And finally, there's a fear of isolation. Those of us whose minds work differently, whether that's a result of mental illness or neurodivergence or both, are all too aware that we are not like other people, that other people find us hard to read, just as we do them, that people find us frustrating, exhausting, or embarrassing. We don't want to spend our lives needing help, but not being well enough to give it in return. We don't want to spend our lives advocating for changes to make our lives richer, fulfilling, regular, bearable, livable, knowing those changes come at a cost to the people we care about. We'd far rather just get on with life. And many of us, especially in the early episodes of ill health before cycles of burnout have stripped us of the energy to do so, will put on a mask and pretend, and make ourselves ill, or worse. There is a single dynamic at play in each of these fears, and the actions and inactions rooted in them. Understanding that dynamic is at the heart of creating spaces in which people feel able to talk, able to ask for help, able to believe that they will be listened to and enabled, and I can state this very simply. Those of us living through poor mental health know that talking about it is a very high risk and high consequence step to take. We therefore need to be very sure what the outcome will be before we decide to take that step. So let me break that down, starting with the high consequence. We've already seen some of the consequences of disclosure: less favourable treatment, ostracism, resentment, and loss of opportunity. Those are the situational consequences of disclosing in the wrong place. But there are also personal consequences. This applies to all disabled people, and we can express it again very simply. We start with fewer resources than other people. More things take resources for us than for other people, and those things take more resources than they do for other people. The effort is something as simple to most people as a phone call, for example, can take me a week to prepare for and a week to recover from, during which time I won't have the energy to spend time with friends, go out, do my work as well as I otherwise could. Talking about our medical situation makes that pale by comparison. It will leave someone wrung out with anxiety and exhaustion for weeks before and after, and that's if everything goes well. In other words, deciding to talk is a big thing, with a huge resource cost. We need to be sure it will be worth it. So what about the risk? How likely is it that the negative consequences will arise from a disclosure? When it comes to the immediate resource cost described above, it's a certainty, and that's the highest risk you can get, for a very high consequence. And the social consequences, sadly, most of us have a long history of experiencing them. Many of us are used to the sigh and the eye roll as a response. And while, if I did that for you, I'd have to do it for everybody, and, but you don't look ill, have become cliches, they became so because most of us have experienced them in the wild. Most people who have experienced poor mental health over a sustained period will have a long history of adverse reactions to our attempts to talk or ask for help. I outlined a couple of mine at the start. I could have picked many more, and I am in no way an outlier. The result of all these factors is this: we have, of necessity, become very good at spotting indicators of safe and unsafe environments. If we're going to preserve enough resources to derive any pleasure or meaning from our lives, we have to avoid the situations that will drain them without giving back. If we're to avoid adding new layers of trauma to lives already exhausted and teetering on the edge of breaking irrecoverably, we cannot afford to talk in places where we perceive the risk of doing so to be high. And that brings us to the heart of this talk. Those shortcuts are found in the culture and communication of an organisation and the individuals within it. Not those aspects of culture explicitly related to mental health. We know that organisations overstate commitment and understate delivery, and we expect it. Rather, we look at those things that give away what people really feel when they think no one's listening. More often still, when the underlying disposition is so embedded, they don't realise it's there at all. These will include an organisation's reaction under pressure, whether that's a financial pressure, staffing pressure, or unexpected political circumstances, or a pandemic arriving out of the blue. They will include casual remarks over drinks, including remarks about who is and is not at the room for those drinks, the wording of basic communications, the framing of invitations and adverts, the way someone handles requests that are nothing to do with mental health. So let's go back to our inquisitive but despairing manager. If what can I do is the question, then pay attention to the things you are saying when you're not saying anything about mental health is the answer. But however apposite an aphorism may be, what does it mean in practice? So what I want to build up to are some steps leadership teams and individuals can take to create a culture that sends that message, it's different here, that hints this time you can talk safely. And I'll start with stationery, or rather what stationery can teach us about the messages our seemingly mundane actions and interactions convey. So many of you will have heard this before, but this is a story about a purple paperclip. It starts with a line manager, Steve, sitting at his desk, shaking his head. He's just had to send a final email to Jem. After months of escalating procedures through Jem's sickness, he's finally let them go. What more could he have done? If only you'd come to me earlier, I could have done something, he wrote. But he thinks to himself as he closes his laptop, shrugs and gets on with his day, how could I have known? Now our story takes us back in time, to that first day in the new office as Jem excitedly arranges the things on their new desk. The purple journal and pen, the purple photo frame and the purple letter tray they've had since student days. Are you all set up? Asks their new boss, Steve. Anything you need, you can order it up from supplies. Well, says Jem enthusiastically, I just need some paper clips. I saw the catalogue has some purple ones. It would be epic if I could have some of those. But you can have purple paper clips, my team in the front row, if you can find them. I find it really hard to find them, actually. Sorry, says Steve. We have a supply of plain metal clips in the cupboard. Help yourself. You know what they say, watch the pennies. Jem smiles, knowing that it's the correct reaction to the first thing your new boss says to you. Inside, they shrink a little, the light dims, something begins to die, a familiar wall goes up. That night, they take their purple journal back to the sanctuary of home. It's nothing they haven't been through before, they reflect as they stare at the ceiling, unable to sleep. They'd hoped it would be different this time. But if that's how Steve reacts when they ask for something as small as a purple paperclip, there's no way he's going to listen to what they need to make the office work for their depression. In short, if you want to make it safe for your team to talk to you about their mental health, what matters most is how you behave long before they ever need to approach you. The way you talk about and act around things that might seem really trivial tells such an important story about how you would respond to someone coming to you to talk about the things that really matter. Second, well-being is not the whole solution, and sometimes it can be part of the problem. Right now it's Mental Health Awareness Week. Many organisations will be holding many events, and many of those will be focused on well-being. And promoting well-being is great. Many of the things individuals and institutions do to promote well-being are great. But wellness and illness are different things, and the problem comes when we treat them the same, and in particular, when we treat their budgets the same. For organisations, this means in particular when all of the mind-related communication and even more budget is directed at wellness, and there is nothing left for illness, those who are ill receive a very clear message about how that organisation sees the relationship between the two. Specifically, it sends a message that resources are prioritised for those who are fundamentally well in order to make their lives a little better, rather than at those who are ill in order to help them thrive at work. That may or may not be an organisation's intention in pushing its glossally photographed llama petting programmes. I have nothing against glossally photographed llama petting programmes, but it is certainly the message many of us who live with poor mental health will take. Which brings us to the third principle, transparency. This is where it gets really, really hard for me speaking to this particular audience, because I'm aware of the imperfection of large organisations. I'm aware that I'm part of such an organisation and both bound up in and implicated by those imperfections. And when it comes to transparency, the imperfection is, did I write this? When it comes to transparency, the imperfection is very clear. Oh dear. The transparency I'm talking about runs counter not just to intuition and institutional culture. We can work on both of those. It often runs counter to institutional risk aversion that comes wrapped up in policies we often cannot sidestep. But we can and should apologise for the fact that happens, and that I do willingly. Probably more than it's prudent for me to do, but not as much as I should. The principle, though, is a sound one. The transparency I'm talking about is transparency about what cannot be done. Openness about what is not possible is one of the clearest clues of a culture that understands the needs of disabled people in general, and those with poor mental health in particular. It rests upon the truth of resources that we have already stated. We start with fewer. More things use them. They use more of them. That means we need to be able to deploy our resources where they are most effective and avoid deploying them where doing so will get us nowhere. The practical upshot of this is very simple. If at some point in a process we're going to run up against a barrier we cannot get around, the most useful thing is for us to know right at the start. Then we can walk away before we even begin, and we will have wasted no resources. The longer we're kept waiting to find out about the barrier, the more resources we will have used. And remember, for us, that means nights without seeing friends, days with no work getting done, opportunities we have to say no to, relaxing and recovery time we cannot have, and we still get nothing at the end. There are several reasons why organisations aren't transparent about what they can do. There's risk aversion. Often they know they should do something, and admitting they can't is an admission of guilt. It's not a good reason, but I get it. It's still not a good reason. There is deeply ingrained marketing wisdom that says you trumpet what you can do and hide what you can't. I get that. For many well people and for many neurotypical people, I think it works. It still sends a message to me as a neurodivergent and mentally unwell person, which is something organisations need to own and live with. There's not knowing, which is not a good reason. If you don't know something about a significant part of your user base, you either weren't paying attention when they told you or you didn't ask them, and neither is a great look. Finally, in the deepest circle of bad reason hell, is the belief that actually if we tried hard enough, we'd manage to do the thing. I talked about my own experience of this at the start. When it comes to the things people are unable to do or can do only at an extreme resource cost, because of mental ill health. This is just another version of not believing that mental illness is real. So wherever you can, be transparent. And that brings us to our fourth principle, and turtles. We touched upon difficulties of exercising transparency in a large organisation, but this is indicative of a problem that goes far beyond transparency. For someone in a leadership position to make good decisions for those in their team, they need to know that their own manager will support them in doing so. And their own manager will only be supportive if they know they will not get roasted in their turn, and so on and so on. In other words, to invert the familiar saying, we need turtles all the way up. An example of good practice that relies on the principle of turtles all the way up is modelling. In particular, managers and leaders modelling good self-care by talking about their own mental health struggles and taking time out when they need it. I realise this is just ridiculously meta, by the way, that me talking. Okay. When done well, senior people talking about their own struggles can send a powerful message that it's okay to talk about these things, that it's okay to take the time you need to look after yourself. But it is very easy for a manager to talk about their own self-care whilst their team listening on knows that were they to attempt the same, it would not be possible. As managers, we can have flexibility that we often do not afford our teams. Very often self-care at work relies upon that flexibility, the flexibility to work from home, to get up and go for a walk, to shift the hours of one's working day. If that is the case, then talking about our own struggles is only good practice if we afford those same opportunities to all in our teams who need them. Otherwise, talking about self-care comes across as being oblivious to one's own privilege and sends the opposite message to the one intended. But for managers to be able to afford those opportunities, they need to know the whole hierarchy above them will not collapse in on them if they do so. Our penultimate principle speaks to the most important consequence of our scouring for shorthand signals and our self-preservation in avoiding situations where we don't feel safe. It's a very simple one. You only get one chance to make a first impression. Like good empiricists, those of us living with poor mental health apportion our belief according to the reliability and weight of the evidence. And the most hefty and reliable evidence of someone's real feelings about mental health comes in the moments before they realise they are conveying that evidence. It's in the throwaway remark, the nervous laugh. All too often it's in the sigh and the eye roll before they catch themselves and realise the image they know they ought to convey. That's the evidence that tells us what will happen when our back is against the wall, our chips are down and we are most in need. And the final principle underpins all of the above, and it's the most counterintuitive of all, but the one that will, if implemented, make the biggest difference to the culture of any space. Understand what you don't understand, and don't try to use empathy where it is impossible to do so. When your mind works differently, whether it's wired that way or through temporary or long-term illness, you experience the world differently. This includes your experience of the obstacles everyone faces in life. This makes it really hard for people to understand us, creating an empathy gap. It's important to realise this is not a moral failing. It's not a failing at all. It's simply a fact. But it's vitally important that everyone is clear that this is not a failing, because it's that fear of being seen as falling short, especially when it comes to understanding, that can lead people to try to understand and think they do understand when they don't, indeed can't, because the consequences of failed attempts at understanding can be catastrophic. But if you understand this empathy gap, that frees you from trying to understand things you can't, and frees you to understand the things that matter, like knowing how to help someone whose experience is fundamentally different from yours, and knowing how to talk about your own experience without invalidating that of others. This gap in understanding manifests itself in two ways. The first can be expressed. The easier it is for most people to do something, the harder they will find it to understand people who cannot. We see this every day in some of the more cruel and unreflective humour online. Take the meme about pre-packaged peeled oranges that wittily points out that oranges already come in pre-packaged situation, namely orange peel. Because most people can peel an orange, It's so taken for granted it doesn't occur to them that some people cannot. So many will assume anyone who buys prepackaged fruit is lazy or spoilt and wealthy, the irony, and will just laugh at them. And the second can be expressed. If you find an activity inconvenient, you will tend to incorrectly believe that you understand people who find it inaccessible or impossible. We can see this in those things that annoy everyone, like long telephone queues. No one likes to be hanging on for an hour not knowing when HMRC will pick up to discuss their tax return. So they assume when disabled people talk about it being inaccessible that it's the same thing. Frustration and an hour wasted. The fact someone gets that it's annoying makes it harder for them to get that the uncertainty, anxiety, continual loops of scripting and processing, auditory focus and cognitive overload make it impossible for someone else and will lead to a loss of speech and several days of recovery. It leads to a form of survivor bias. I find this hard, but I still managed to do it this morning and get to work this afternoon. Can easily become, if you don't get back to work this afternoon after doing it, you're clearly lazy. And if you couldn't do it at all, I'll find you some time management and motivational training so you can try harder next time. Both of these aspects of the empathy gap lead to hasty judgments, and those judgments lead to a lack of support. They also feed into a cycle of trauma. Many disabled people who have struggled with things since childhood will have been called lazy by their teachers, their peers, many even by our parents. They will have made themselves ill trying to try harder. They will have burned out as a result, felt guilty, a burden, and most of all, utterly confused as to why they can't do the things that other people can. That's the background people's humour about orange peel or time management comments feeds into. Hardly the best way to send the message that it's safe to talk. Of course, this is not just about malign thoughtfulness. It applies even more to benign actions deriving from not enough thought of the right kind. And this is where it explains so much of the damaging messaging that comes from organisations that are completely unaware of the impact their attempt to show solidarity, to demonstrate a common feeling can have, when that sense of commonality is built on a misunderstanding. Managers often seek to encourage or show solidarity with their teams by telling them at the end of a long week, we're all tired, or many similar utterances. The problem is that if your version of exhaustion means you can go home and cook dinner, or see your friends, or spend Saturday morning doing your hobbies, then your exhaustion is not the same as someone who hits the pillow in desperation the moment they're in the door and curls up in a frantic hope that by Monday morning they'll be able to get back out of the door without collapsing. Stating solidarity loads back all those feelings we had at school when we tried to do what other people could do and concluded that because we couldn't, we weren't trying hard enough. And all because of an internalised or external articulation of a moral judgment about something that simply isn't possible. When acknowledging the gaps between our experience can be the thing that builds the bridge between us. I'm really sorry. I can't begin to imagine that's what that's like, but I'm here beside you. That would do. That would more than do. So what about community? How do we build spaces where people living with poor mental health don't feel as though they are surrounded by a community of which we are not a part? It's hard not to conclude with glibness or cliche. Chill out would be one conclusion, by which I mean neither insist on nor assume similarities that will never be there, but be okay with people being different together, and do things to support people before you're asked, so that as much as possible, people don't have to disclose things they might not be comfortable disclosing. That's the basic principle of accessible design. Indeed, using the principles and practices of accessible design is one of the most powerful ways you can demonstrate good faith. To go into any depth on that would require a whole book. Fortunately, I've just written one, which I have copies of here if you want to buy one. Accessible design was the subject of this year's excellent disability lecture, delivered last night by Sam Hallison, that some of you who are here today will have been at. Sam was the head of mathematics when the Andrew Wiles building was under construction. which is the perfect segue to the end of this talk, because avoiding a glib rehash of a conclusion is often best done with a poem. So I'll end with a poem I wrote for the 2016 Disability Lecture, and huge apologies to those who believe that poetry should always be performed and not read, but it's been 9 years, so I haven't had time to memorise it. Stigma is the thing with branches, the miserly larch that will not shed its spines in winter, the hollow hinterland that marches to horizons where the eyes of reason and compassion cannot follow. We tread a path into the wilderness, that bewildered mess of passions dressed in dust, fashioned from half-started lives, now carcasses of rust. Ashes from the list of everything we thought we'd be, caressing from the shards of carbon, filaments of empathy from which tomorrow built a nest. See, I can fly, but sometimes I need you to give me wings. My heart is full of song, but I sometimes need your love to amp me when I sing. I could reel off everything I've done, campaigns run, medals won, poems told and stories spun, and I feel I'm in a minority of one when I say, May, the hardest thing I've ever done was get out of bed, put down the pills, pick up some clothes and face the sun. And all they can say is, the least you could do is put on a tie. And I think, look, you can have me shine, well, maybe not shine, but at least get by like this. Or you can have the last light in me die. It's simple to say you care, and that is not enough. It's easy to find fine words to share, and that is not enough. It's easy to put faces on the walls. It's easy to celebrate the ones who did it all. It's easy to embrace a culture of support until we fall. We talk glibly of a human cost, as though we know a world that will not change becomes a junkyard where depositories of genius are tossed. But this is also hope damped down. It's smoking embers of a dream stamped out like cigarettes. It's kisses choked before they leave the throat. It's everything that adds up to a life lost. Will not beat stigma with celebrations of high flyers, by filling dreaming spires with choirs of good intentions, idolizing outliers, by glamorizing myths of brilliant madness or fetishizing funeral pyres. Their victory is this, that they are known not by a label but a name, and our wish, our dream, our right is only for the same. Thank you.